The wind howled against the windows that night, making the old glass panes shudder with every gust. Cedarville rarely saw a winter storm this fierce. Branches twisted under the weight of the wind, porch beams groaned in the thick darkness. I had just laid down on my creaky wooden bed when the knocking came. First soft, then urgent, desperate, as if whoever stood outside was barely holding on. My heart skipped a beat. I rushed to the door barefoot, an ominous fear tightening in my chest. When I swung the door open, under the faint yellow glow of the porch light, I saw Ellie, my daughter, standing there. Soaked to the bone, her hair clinging to her pale face, her clothes plastered to her shivering frame. Tears mingled with raindrops as they ran down her cheeks. In that moment, I felt my heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. Without a word, I pulled her into my arms, wrapping her in a hug meant to shield her from all the storms of the world. Her body was icy cold against mine, so fragile that I feared even the wind might snatch her away. I guided Ellie inside, hastily wrapping a thick blanket around her trembling shoulders. She said nothing, just buried her face in my chest and sobbed. Raw, broken sobs that cut into me like knives. The storm raged on outside, but inside our little house, time seemed to stand still. I sat back in the old armchair, holding her close like I used to when she was small, and the memories flooded back, vivid and sharp, as if no time had passed at all. The day Ellie was born was the day my world changed forever. Grace, my wife, passed away just hours after placing our newborn daughter into my arms. I, a simple auto mechanic, suddenly found myself a single father, overwhelmed and terrified, but filled with a love deeper than anything I had ever known. I raised Ellie with my calloused hands and a heart full of scars. Through the cold winter nights, I stayed awake beside her crib, watching over her tiny chest rising and falling. Through the scorching summer days, I carried her across golden fields so she could pick wildflowers. We didn't have much, no fancy vacations, no new toys every season. But we had each other, and for me, that was more precious than anything money could buy. I worked at a small garage on Willow Street, took extra shifts at the diner, chopped firewood in the winters. Anything to save up. Every spare dollar went into an old tin box, a dream carefully tucked away. One day I would buy Ellie a house of her own, a safe place, a warm place, a place no one could ever take from her. I still remember those evenings when Ellie and I would sit on the porch and sketch out our dream home. A wide front porch where she could plant flowers, a cozy kitchen where we'd bake cookies on rainy days, a worn-out swing hanging from the old maple tree in the backyard. Ellie grew up into a bright, kind-hearted girl. She loved books, fairy tales, and believed, with all her heart, that the world was a good and gentle place. And I told myself, if Ellie could keep that light alive inside her, then every hardship I endured would be worth it. But life is rarely a fairy tale. Brandon Whitmore entered Ellie's life on a spring afternoon when the cherry blossoms painted the streets of Cedarville white with petals. I still remember that evening when Ellie brought him home, laughing together under the worn roof of our little house. Brandon had all the traits of a successful young man: crisp khakis, a neatly pressed button-up shirt, and a smile so warm it almost seemed genuine. Throughout that dinner, Brandon knew exactly how to make others feel at ease. He listened attentively to my stories about working at the garage, smiled at the right moments, tossed in a few well-placed jokes. The way he rested his hand gently on Ellie's shoulder, the proud gleam in his eyes, or what I thought was pride, fooled me into believing that my daughter had found a good man. Still, something tiny, almost imperceptible, stirred uneasily inside me. A fleeting glance at his watch while Ellie spoke excitedly about planting a garden, a slight frown when she spilled a glass of water by mistake. Little things, not enough to accuse, but enough to make a father's heart wary. The Whitmore family wasted no time in pulling Ellie into their world. Harper Whitmore, Brandon's older sister, took a particular interest in her. She invited Ellie to tea parties, to charity galas, to luncheons at grand houses with shining chandeliers and polished floors, places we Carters had only ever seen from afar. In those bright rooms filled with laughter and glittering wine glasses, Ellie, my daughter from a humble home, stood awkward and unsure. And Harper, always smiling, always helpful, was there to guide her, with sweet words. "You need to think bigger, Ellie, to manage your future properly." With subtle suggestions, "In our circles, dear, everything must be orderly, documented, under control." Bit by bit, Harper and Brandon chipped away at Ellie's roots. The simple joys, the small dreams she once held close. They planted seeds of doubt, making her feel naive, unworthy, small. I noticed the changes. Ellie laughed less. Her visits home grew fewer and farther between, and when she did come, she seemed distracted, constantly checking her phone, always rushing to get back. One evening, sitting on the porch under the soft amber light, I asked her quietly, "Ellie, are you sure you're happy?" She looked at me with a strained smile, her fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve. "I'm fine, Dad. It's just, things are different now. I have to grow up," she whispered. Then, squeezing my hand tightly, she added barely audibly, "Don't worry about me. I'll be okay. I promise." I wanted to believe her. With all my heart, I wanted to believe her. But deep down, I knew something was slipping away. It wasn't long before Harper suggested helping Ellie manage her assets more properly. "For legal convenience," Harper said, her voice dripping with honey. Brandon readily agreed. They proposed combining their assets under one name, Brandon's, for the sake of family unity. Caught in the whirlwind of her new life, desperate to belong, Ellie agreed. They handed her a stack of documents to sign. No independent lawyer, no second opinion, just reassuring smiles and a pen pressed into her trembling fingers. Outside the window, the first autumn winds whispered through the trees, carrying with them a chill that Ellie never noticed. The day she signed those papers, she unknowingly signed away her freedom. As time passed, little cracks began to appear in Ellie's life. Small at first, almost invisible. It started with Harper's subtle comments every time Ellie made a decision on her own. "Maybe you should check with Brandon first." Suggestions wrapped in smiles chipping away at Ellie's confidence. Brandon, once attentive and warm, grew distant. Gone were the evenings of laughter and quiet conversations. In their place came critical glances, curt words, heavy silences. Ellie tried harder. She organized, planned, bent herself backwards to fit into their world. She signed more papers, always for the family's sake, trusting Brandon and Harper, trusting their reassurances. She never saw the trap tightening around her. One afternoon, after a disagreement about finances, everything unraveled. Brandon, standing tall in the living room of the house I had given my daughter, looked down at Ellie with cold, unrecognizable eyes. "This isn't your home anymore," he said, voice flat, devoid of any affection. "You need to leave." Harper stood behind him, arms crossed, wearing a smug smile that made my blood boil even in memory. Ellie, clutching Mason to her chest, pleaded, cried, but Brandon turned his back without a second glance. Harper closed the door behind them with a finality that echoed like a gunshot. Outside, the rain fell in heavy sheets, drenching Ellie and Mason as they stumbled into the night. Homeless, heartbroken, betrayed, somehow her feet led her home. To my home. When I opened the door that night and saw my daughter standing there, soaked to the bone, trembling with cold and despair, I felt something inside me break beyond repair. I pulled Ellie inside, wrapped her in blankets, held her as she sobbed while the storm outside battered our old house. We had thought the worst was over, but it was only beginning. Days blurred into nights. Ellie barely spoke. She moved like a ghost through the house, caring for Mason but otherwise lost in her own grief. She sat for hours by the window, staring at nothing, a hollow shell of the bright girl I once knew. Mason, once a lively, curious little boy, grew quiet and clingy, fearful of every shadow. And then Mason fell ill. A fever hit him hard and fast, burning through his small body like wildfire. We rushed him to St. Luke's Hospital in the dead of night, Ellie clutching him tightly, eyes wild with fear. I stood outside the hospital room watching my daughter kneel by her son's bedside, her hands trembling over his small chest, whispering prayers into the sterile air. I had never felt so helpless. In that moment, I realized we hadn't just lost a house. We had lost innocence. We had lost trust. We had lost the belief that good things would always stay good, and somehow we would have to find a way to keep going anyway. The first days after deciding to fight back filled our small house with a strange heaviness, a mix of fragile hope and raw fear. Ellie sat for hours at the old kitchen table, sifting through every scrap of paper she could find. Bank statements, text messages from Harper, crumpled receipts, anything that might prove the truth. Every document she touched seemed to weigh a ton. Sometimes Ellie would break down, tears blurring the ink, her hands shaking too much to write. But little by little she fought through it, not to forget the pain, but to turn it into armor. Of course, the Whitmores didn't sit idly by. The moment they caught wind of our efforts, the harassment began. One morning, Ellie found her car's brake lines cut just as she was about to take Mason to preschool. By sheer instinct, she sensed something wrong before pulling onto the main road. The police report was polite but useless. In a town like Cedarville, the Whitmores had friends in every corner. Another day, David Monroe, our trusted lawyer and family friend, caught a man with a telephoto lens lurking outside his office window. That night, someone broke into his office. Nothing was stolen, but every drawer had been rifled through. And then came the letters. Anonymous notes shoved into our mailbox. Drop the case or lose everything. At first, Ellie shook with fear at every shadow. She jumped at every knock on the door, clutched Mason closer whenever a strange car drove by. But slowly, stubbornly, she began to change. She learned to channel the fear into focus. She stayed up late, compiling files, cross-referencing timelines. She went over her deposition again and again, her voice growing steadier with each rehearsal. There were still bad nights, nights when she sat outside under the brittle stars, knees hugged to her chest, whispering doubts into the darkness. I would sit beside her quietly, sharing the cold night air, until finally she would murmur, "I'm scared, Dad." And every time I would answer, "Being scared means you care enough to fight." The morning we filed the lawsuit was gray and cold, a heavy fog hanging over Cedarville. Ellie wore a simple gray coat, Mason clinging to her side. She carried a folder of documents, our story, our truth, tucked firmly under her arm. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She simply walked up the courthouse steps, shoulders squared against the bitter wind, and disappeared through the heavy wooden doors. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something I had almost forgotten. Pride. Whatever happened next, we had chosen to stand and fight. The morning of the first court hearing, the sky over Cedarville hung low and gray, as if mirroring the heavy weight in my chest. We stood before the red brick courthouse, old, worn, its stone steps damp with mist. Climbing them felt like ascending a mountain with lead in our boots. Ellie gripped my hand tightly. "I'll be okay," she whispered, not to reassure me, but to steel herself. I nodded, squeezing her hand back, the same hand I once held when she took her first wobbly steps. The same hand now clutching onto justice with quiet, fierce determination. Across the courtroom, Brandon and Harper sat, polished and proud in tailored suits. Their faces wore polite smiles, masks of civility hiding the rot underneath. Behind them, a wall of high-priced lawyers sat with their briefcases and cold eyes. The courtroom was packed. All of Cedarville seemed to have come. Curious neighbors, old friends, people who once whispered behind our backs, all now craning their necks for a better view. Ellie sat at the witness stand, her back straight, her chin lifted. Her hands trembled only slightly in her lap. The Whitmore's lawyer was relentless. He painted Ellie as naive, irresponsible, incapable of handling property or finances. He spun stories about how the Whitmores had saved her from herself, wrapping their betrayal in layers of silk and lies. Question after question, they tried to corner Ellie, to break her. There were moments she faltered, her voice catching, moments she closed her eyes too long, fighting back tears, but every time she opened them again and spoke her truth. "I trusted them," she said quietly once, voice shaking but firm. "And they used that trust to take everything I had." The words hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Then it was our turn. David Monroe stood slowly, unhurried, carrying a single manila folder. One by one, he laid out the evidence. The manipulative text messages, the suspicious bank transfers, the hurried paperwork signed under pressure, and finally, he played the recording. In the crackling audio, Harper's voice rang out, smug and triumphant. "Finally got that stupid girl to sign. The house is ours now." The courtroom froze. Brandon went pale. Harper muttered frantic denials. Their lawyers shifted uncomfortably, but there was no escaping it. No clever spin could erase the gleeful malice in Harper's voice. The judge, an old man with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, sat silently for a long moment after the last echo of Harper's words faded. When he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, but carried the weight of a hammer striking an anvil. The property transfer was nullified. Full ownership of the house was restored to Ellie Carter. The Whitmores were ordered to pay damages and legal fees for fraud and coercion. When the final gavel struck the bench, Ellie crumpled into tears, not the broken sobs of defeat, but the fierce, cathartic cries of someone who had clawed their way through hell and emerged, bloodied but unbowed. I wrapped my arms around her. Mason rushed forward, flinging his small arms around both of us. For a long time, we just held each other, oblivious to the murmuring crowd, oblivious to everything but the sharp, blinding relief that poured over us. We hadn't just won a case, we had reclaimed our dignity, our voice, our right to exist without fear. Winning in court felt like rain after a long drought. It soaked into the dry earth, giving life where death had crept in. But the cracks remained, etched deep and stubborn. Ellie sat quietly on the front steps of the little house on Willow Creek Lane, holding the court's decision in her hands. The house looked much the same, a sagging roof, a leaning white fence, crumbling stone steps. But in Ellie's eyes it was more than wood and nails. It was memory. It was blood and tears and dreams stitched together by love and loss. The first days were a blur of work. Ellie and I scrubbed years of dust from the floors, patched up peeling walls, painted the old porch anew. Mason, barely 4 years old, trailed after us with a paintbrush too big for his tiny hands, giggling whenever he splashed paint on himself. Some days Ellie would sit down heavily on the porch steps. Exhaustion pulling at her features, she would close her eyes, too tired to even speak. But Mason would appear, clutching a crushed wildflower, his face radiant. Ellie would open her eyes and smile, a real smile, and somehow find the strength to stand up and keep going. Healing wasn't just fixing broken wood or painting over stains. It was stitching together a broken heart, a fractured soul. Ellie found work again, a part-time job at the town library, sorting books in the children's section. At first, the whispers followed her, old gossip lingering in the air. But over time, Cedarville changed the way it looked at her. The woman who once walked with her head bowed now stood tall, reading to children under the oak tree, helping elderly neighbors carry groceries, smiling not with naive innocence, but with earned, unshakable grace. Mason thrived, too. The little boy who once cowered at every sudden noise now raced barefoot through the backyard, laughing wildly, clutching wooden swords and paper crowns. Each evening he curled up beside Ellie on the porch swing, reading stories out loud in his sweet, stumbling voice, the sunset painting gold across their faces. It wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect. Some days Ellie came home bone-tired, her hands raw from shelving books, her back aching. Some nights she woke gasping from nightmares she didn't talk about. But step by step, smile by smile, the life she rebuilt grew stronger. One evening, as I sat mending the old rocking chair, Ellie came to me with a stack of brochures. "I'm thinking of enrolling in a library sciences program," she said softly. I looked up, seeing the glow in her eyes, a quiet determination, born not of desperation, but of hope. "I don't want to just survive, Dad," she said. "I want to live." I didn't have words, only a thick, overwhelming pride. I reached out and squeezed her hand, the way I had the day she first learned to walk. And just like then, I knew. She was ready to take the next step on her own. Life didn't become a fairy tale, but in that small house, laughter returned, hope returned. And sometimes, when the world seemed too big, too loud, too cruel, we held on to each other and remembered. Even after the fiercest storm, even after the darkest night, there could be morning. Years passed, quiet and gentle, like the lazy river winding behind our little backyard. Mason grew tall and strong, with eyes that still shone with wonder, the same spark I used to see in Ellie's when she was a child. He smiled easily, spoke kindly, and carried within him a resilience carved by every hard-earned lesson of our past. Each morning Mason rode his bicycle down Willow Creek Lane, waving at neighbors with a confidence that once seemed impossible. Each afternoon he helped Ellie shelve books at the library, reading aloud to younger children, his voice animated and bright. To the people of Cedarville, Mason became a symbol, a reminder that from brokenness, something strong and beautiful could still rise. Ellie, too, found her peace. No longer did she wake trembling in the night. No longer did she flinch at the sound of unexpected footsteps. She worked hard, managing the library's children's programs, planting flowers in the garden behind our house, smiling more often, laughing freely. The shadows of the past still lingered, faint and distant, but they no longer held her captive. They had become part of her story. Not the end, but a chapter among many. When Mason graduated from high school, we threw a small party in the backyard. Twinkling fairy lights draped across the newly repaired fence. The scent of home-baked pies and fresh-cut grass filled the warm summer air. Children laughed, music floated softly from an old radio, and Ellie, standing barefoot in the grass, glowed with a happiness so full it seemed to light up the night. I sat back in my rocking chair, watching it all unfold, feeling a profound, wordless gratitude. We had weathered the storm, we had rebuilt, we had survived. One crisp autumn afternoon, as golden leaves carpeted the ground, Ellie sat beside me on the porch swing, a mug of steaming tea in her hands. "Dad," she said, her voice low and steady, "I'm not afraid of storms anymore." I turned to her, catching the glint of sunlight in her hair, the fine lines at the corners of her smiling eyes. "I've learned," she continued, "that after every storm, something stronger grows." I didn't answer right away. I just reached over, took her hand in mine, and held it. Around us, the wind rustled through the trees, whispering promises of new seasons yet to come.